In my last video titled The Run, I left everyone with a bit of a cliffhanger regarding what the next system might look like. Here I will pick up where I left off. If you haven't yet watched The Run, you might take a few minutes to do so now before watching this video. If you recall, what led to the abandonment of the gold standard was the periodic overissuance of credit denominated in currencies which were redeemable in gold, followed by a general loss of confidence in the ability of counterparties to perform. The losses of confidence led to bank runs in the early 20th century and ultimately a run on the U.S. Treasury in the late 20th century. Over time, the system evolved in such a way as to sever the direct convertibility of currencies and gold. The petrodollar emerged as the primary trading and reserve asset of the world. This petrodollar system worked for a few decades because the U.S. managed to keep the dollar strong in gold, and thus the oil states accepted it in payment for oil. I outlined the mechanism by which this worked in my videos titled When Gold and Silver Go Into Hiding and The Gold Must Flow. Again, if you haven't watched those videos, now might be a good time to do so before proceeding. But the petrodollar system has provided a major privilege to the United States, and thus a major disadvantage to other important world trading blocs, namely Europe and Asia. Despite waning political support for the petrodollar, Europe and Asia have bided their time, supporting the petrodollar for the sake of maintaining international trade, meanwhile devising a new currency system architecture which can replace the petrodollar system when the time is right. Let's start this discussion by taking a very high-level look at international trade and see what it can tell us about the future. Now, this model of world trade will necessarily be overly simplistic, but I think it will serve our purpose. Let's imagine the transfer of goods between, say, the United States and China. A company in the United States would like to obtain goods from a company in China. Generally, because of payment terms of 30 to 90 days, the goods are delivered prior to settlement in currency. So first, the container ship arrives in port in the US, and then the currency transaction is settled. The company in China wants to be paid in yuan, so there must first be a currency exchange where dollars are traded for yuan. This results in a dollar credit being produced in the banking system in China. Of course, the story doesn't end there. The banking system in China will have to figure out what to do with these dollar credits. If a company in China wants to purchase goods from a US company, it will tend to counterbalance the prior exchange. Goods will be transported from the US to China. The Chinese company will purchase dollars with yuan and then use those dollars to settle the transaction. If, in a given year, the sum of all goods moving from China to the US and the sum of all goods moving from the US to China are of equal value, then the transactions extinguish themselves, and there is no net imbalance of trade. But that's not what's been happening over the past few decades. For quite some time, the US has been running a trade deficit. Goods have been pouring in from all over the world. That's not to say that the US hasn't done its fair share of exporting. However, the total value of goods exported from the US has been far less than the total value of goods imported into the US. As this process went on, the amount of dollar credits existing in the banking systems of other nations and trading blocs increased. And now where the world stands is that there are a very large amount of dollar credits in the banking systems of other nations and trading blocs. These dollar credits are what are called currency exchange reserves. Now, this is not to say that the dollar is the only reserve held by international banks. Far from it. The same process has resulted in international banks holding other currency reserves as well. Over time, the central banks of the world have established reserves in all major world currencies that are important to international trade. Of these, the largest reserves tend to be US dollars. Part of this is a legacy from the Bretton Woods system. Part of this is due to the petrodollar's dominance due to the support lent to it by the oil states. The sheer number of dollar credits that have been accumulated over the years is enormous. It has resulted in the US being able to enjoy years of consuming more than it produced, and has been a major source of consternation for other nations. Still, it takes time for major international systems of trade to adjust, and so dollar accumulation has continued. Now, how these foreign exchange reserves are used is important to understanding the architecture of the new system that is to come. Let's take, for example, the interplay between the US and Europe to show how the possession of foreign exchange reserves can make a local currency very strong in terms of purchasing power. We've already discussed that the US, in order to maintain the support of the oil states for the petrodollar, has a vested interest in keeping the dollar strong in gold. It does this by leasing gold to the bullion banks, which in turn act as financial intermediaries between the mining industry and the oil states. The gold leasing operation weakens the price of the dollar in terms of gold and provides the motivation for oil to bid for dollars. How can Europe use this to their advantage? Well, if Europe decided that it wanted the euro to also be strong in gold, then all it needs to do is make the euro strong in terms of the dollar. All the ECB would need to do is make an offer to sell their dollar reserves in exchange for existing euro, and it would immediately strengthen the euro and weaken the dollar. There would be more demand for the euro on the open market and a greater supply of dollars. The net result would be for the dollar to weaken in terms of gold and the euro to strengthen in terms of gold. Consequently, the price of other items, such as oil, in terms of euro, would tend to go down while rising in terms of the dollar. But the funny thing is, the threat of selling foreign exchange reserves does not need to be done overtly to have a noticeable impact on the value of a currency. The international trading community is fully aware of the possible uses of foreign exchange reserves, and they tend to price the possibilities of such moves into the value of the currency. Thus, the presence of large quantities of foreign exchange reserves is enough to strengthen a currency. Case in point is the strengthening of the Chinese yuan over the past decade. It's true that China has managed to slow the rate of ascent of the value of the yuan, but the strengthening was inevitable due to the large accumulation of dollar reserves. But major nations and trading blocs have faced a major problem over the years. The US, because it had much gold to lease, enjoyed a very enviable trading position whereby it could enjoy importing more goods than it exported. In addition, there was always the threat that something would happen to the value of the US dollar. Thus, if the US dollar suddenly weakened in purchasing power for any reason, it could have a major detrimental impact on the ability to carry out international trade. Thus the problem. The dollar needed to be dethroned as the major world reserve currency, but not so quickly that it disrupted international trade. And so, decades ago, some very influential Europeans started working on an architecture for a currency unit whereby gold would gradually displace the dollar as the world reserve asset. The idea was to inspire the major governments of the world to hold gold as an exchange reserve. It would have the same effect as using the dollar as an exchange reserve, but would be far less dependent upon the financial health of the United States. The idea was revolutionary. Rather than backing the currency with gold at a fixed exchange rate, the currency was given strength simply via the possession of a significant amount of gold. Think of it this way. The possession of a major amount of currency reserves can give a local currency strength simply through the possible threat of sales of that currency reserve in exchange for the local currency. If the possession of significant currency reserves is a potential weapon in a currency war, then the possession of significant gold reserves is like a nuclear weapon. Gold can either be sold on the open market in exchange for the local currency. It can also, in the event of an emergency, be made convertible in that currency at the desired exchange rate. And international traders are fully aware of this. Thus, gold can be held. It can be used to give a currency strength, but it does not have to be sold except in dire circumstances. The bank run problem and treasury run problem of the 20th century has been solved. And so, for many years, the architects of the European Monetary Union worked to gain political support for the idea. To signal their intentions for gold as a reserve asset and also their gradual withdrawal from the gold leasing that had been used to keep the dollar strong in gold, they banded together to make a statement. In an announcement made on September 26, 1999, the central banks of Europe, who accounted for 45% of the world's global gold reserves, announced their intention to limit gold sales and, more importantly, to not increase their lending of gold through the gold derivatives market. It was a signal to the market that the Europeans wanted to give gold a much larger role in world finance. Here is the text of the announcement. In the interest of clarifying their intentions with respect to their gold holdings, the above institutions make the following statement. 1. Gold will remain an important element of global monetary reserves. 2. The above institutions will not enter the market as sellers, with the exception of already decided sales. 3. The gold sales already described will be achieved through the concerted program of sales over the next 5 years. Annual sales will not exceed approximately 400 tons, and total sales over this period will not exceed 2,000 tons. 4. The signatories to this agreement have agreed not to expand their gold leasings and their use of gold futures and options over this period. 5. This agreement will be reviewed every 5 years, and it has been reviewed every 5 years. Each time, it was renewed. And you'll notice the impact this coordinated support for gold and simultaneous withdrawal of support for the dollar's strength in gold has had on the price of gold in dollars. The rise in the price of gold in dollars has been far from trivial. More importantly, the weakening of the dollar in gold terms has been gradual. This was the desired outcome from the very beginning of the Euro project. We've seen the trend reverse somewhat over the past couple of years, but that is mainly due to the gradual abandonment of paper representations of gold in favor of the real physical item. This will be a temporary change of trend, because the Europeans, who are rich in gold, have a vested interest in having it replace the dollar as the dominant wealth reserve of the world. And now we have the Chinese rapidly acquiring real physical gold as well as adding it to their reserves. World political support is strongly in favor of gold at the present time. This support will not change until the dollar's role as international monetary reserve is greatly diminished. It's interesting to look at how the Eurosystem balance sheet is set up. Notice that gold and gold receivables is listed as line item number 1. That's not just a coincidence. Notice further that gold constitutes 53% of their non-euro denominated reserves. That's a very healthy percentage allocated to gold. In September of 1999, when the central bank gold agreement was first signed, gold was only 28% of the Eurosystem exchange reserves, and now it stands at 53%. Most of this change has been due to the increased value of gold relative to the other assets. Gold plays a very special role in the balance sheet that way. As the value of all other reserve currencies, namely the dollar, on their balance sheet decline, the value of the gold increases and more than offsets the loss. The increase is seen because the Eurosystem marks their gold to market prices once per quarter. I anticipate that gradually over time, the percentage of exchange assets represented by gold will approach 100% as the value of their other currency reserves plummet. So what does all this mean for the future? Well, if the lessons of the past are heeded, then the governments will know that gold must be held as a major reserve asset so as to provide support for the currency. The more gold held, the more influence the country or trading bloc will have on the world stage because their currency will be strong. The leaders will also know that they should not make gold directly redeemable in exchange for their currency, for doing so has led to major systemic failures in the past when confidence in the currency declined. Nor will they fix the exchange value of their currency in gold. Pegging the currency to gold severely limits the ability of credit to expand and contract as the market requires. But now, they know that the backing of the currency by gold is not necessary to maintain the strength of the currency, witness the euro. All that is needed is the possession of the gold and the credible threat of potential mobilization of the gold to purchase the currency. The market will price that possibility into the value of the currency, just as it does with foreign exchange reserves. Now, if all of this is true, then governments will actively encourage their citizens to buy and hold gold. They will recognize that gold is not a threat to the currency. Quite the contrary. The more gold that exists inside the borders of a country, the more likely it will be that gold will put in a bid for the currency. After all, it's not just the government who can sell gold to buy their currency back, but the citizens themselves. If a currency is strong, and debt denominated in that currency offers a fair interest rate, then there will be a profit motive that will incent the citizens to sell a portion of their gold in exchange for the currency. Enlightened governments know this. Do you hear news stories that China is encouraging their citizens to buy gold and silver? But the most important aspect of the system of the future is the changing role of gold and currency. Gold will be the preferred store of wealth. Currency will be for trading and for profit. This seems to be the way that things are heading. We'll watch this new market unfold together over the next few years.